All right, so let's resume talking about sex entirely too much. We were talking about why certain traits are selected by potential mates, why it is so great for lizards to have brilliant red and yellow dewlaps, or zebra finches to have brilliant orange beaks and cheek pouches, or for South American frogs to yell tungara, tungara, tungara an awful lot. And we've gone over various hypotheses, all of which have some degree of support, and all of which seem to work in at least some cases. The next that I want to hit is, in some cases, traits might be sexually selected because of a pre-existing sensory bias. The fish that you see here are one of about 20 species in the genus Xiphophorus. They are fish native to southern Mexico, I believe. This is Xiphophorus multilineatus. And the male is the one on the left. And if you look at his tail, it's mostly transparent, and it's mostly just kind of your typical roundish tail fin. But the fin rays on the ventral side, the belly side, are colored and elongated past the margin of the tail into a structure called a sword, even though it's not actually sharp. It's made of the same soft, flexible fin rays that the rest of the tail is made from, and it's not a sting or anything like that. The male is swimming around with his sword on his tail. That's a female on the right of the same species, and she does not, in fact, have a sword. Okay, that's another one. That's a male of the species Xiphophorus helleri, the green swordtail. And I might mention that Xiphophorus helleri is actually popular in the aquarium trade. And in fact, we have artificially selected swordtails with all kinds of neat color patterns. So you could probably go to PetSmart today and spot some fancy swordtails if you felt like it. They usually have. Yes?
That tail to me looks pretty yellow. So I don't know.
The body's got kind of a greenish tone to it. That's why it's called the green swordtail. Yeah, the male's got a yellow sword in this case.
It still seems a bit stretchy.
I'm not the guy who named, well, and this is why we call it Xiphophorus helleri.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is partly why we use scientific names. Anyway, there's about 20 Xiphophorus species. And Xiphophorus helleri is one of the ones where the males have swords, these elongated fin rays. Females never do. But there are other species in the same genus where the males don't have swords. So there are sworded Xiphophorus and non-sworded Xiphophorus. That's a male of one of the non-sworded Xiphophorus. That's a male of Xiphophorus variegatus. The common name, by the way, is platyfish. And platies are also pretty common in the aquarium trade, and there's a lot of varieties that have been selectively bred. It's fairly straightforward to find them in most pet stores. Most pet stores will have platies on any given day. Now here's the weird thing. Females of species that have swords prefer males with swords. So a female Xiphophorus helleri, this species, is going to go for that male because he's got a nice big sword. He's got a nice big fin extension. Okay. The problem is that females of Xiphophorus variegatus, a species where the males don't have swords, actually do prefer males that do have swords. This was worked out by a very persistent researcher named Alexandra Basolo about 25 years ago. There's fairly simple experiments you can do to test female preference, where you have a tank. You put transparent dividers on either side of the tank, so you have a central compartment and two compartments on the side. You put two different males on the left and right and a female in the center, and you just measure how much time the female spends close to one side and not the other side. So if a female spends 4 minutes close to the male on the left and only 1 minute close to the male on the right, presumably that's a strong preference for the male on the left. So that's how you measure that. Basolo worked out a way to cut out artificial swords from very thin plastic that she would sew to the tails of her fish. So she could experimentally manipulate them to have swords of different lengths, different colors. She even made transparent swords because she wanted to make sure that females were being triggered by the presence of a sword, not by the presence of maybe a swimming pattern. If males with swords swim in a funny way, maybe the females are responding to the funny way that they swim, not the sword. But she was able to test that hypothesis with transparent swords that the females couldn't see, and show that no, what the females like is the sword. And the longer the sword, the more the females like it, even in species that do not naturally have them. So what's going on here? You know, why would there be a preference without a corresponding male trait? It turns out that platyfish and swordtails and all members of the genus Ziphophorus, as elegant and beautiful as they are, they're stupid because they're fish. They've got brains the size of large pinheads. Okay, they are not going to be writing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony anytime soon. They're kind of dumb because they're small fish. Okay, with me there. They don't have a huge amount of processing power. So females are not going, hey, if you look at the sword on that one over there. Females are not doing that. Females simply prefer males that are large. Maybe because large males are healthier, or maybe large males, they don't really have parental care, so it's not like the large males are better dads. But maybe large males are healthier and have better genes or something like that. Females, Ziphophorus, prefer big males, but they're not very good at image processing. And having a sword simply makes a male look bigger. You know, they're basically judging male size just based on, you know, oh, there's the mouth, there's the end of the tail. Not really able to break it down into saying, oh, that male's not really big, he just got a big sword. So swords make a male fish look larger. So female preference in some species of Ziphophorus has driven the evolution of male swords, simply because females are wired in such a way that they like mates that are big. And males have evolved swords because it's an energetically cheap way of looking bigger than you really are. So that's a pre-existing sensory bias. Runaway selection is probably the hardest for me to explain clearly. And that's a case of sexual selection on traits for no reason other than the trait is being selected for. And this was shown in a study a few years back of the spotted cucumber beetle, which looks like this, Diabrotica undecim punctata. That's Latin for 11 spots, undecim punctata. And in cucumber beetles, males before mating, stroke the female with their antennae. Okay. As far as anybody can tell, this is not a behavior that does the female any good. It's not a behavior that's an indicator of good genes. There's no survival difference between the offspring of a long-stroking male and a slow-stroking male. Sorry, I really shouldn't do this, but every time I talk about cucumber beetles, I always imagine singing, I want a man with a slow hand. Old country song from the 70s. Right. Anyway, and it seems to be a case of runaway selection. Suppose we start with males that have some feature of the phenotype that varies. There are some males that stroke longer before mating and some that stroke less time before mating. And suppose we have females that vary in their degree of preference for the trait. Some females prefer long strokers and some prefer short strokers. And there doesn't necessarily need to be any reason, deeper reason why. It's just individuals vary. Let's assume that both the trait and the preference are heritable, that they're ultimately got something to do with genes. Well, what it means is that females with a strong preference will choose males with a strong trait. The females that prefer long-stroking males will choose long-stroking males, and their offspring will inherit both the alleles for the trait and the alleles for the preference. Right? Because they will be, the offspring will have a dad that was a long stroker and a female that really liked long strokers, which is why mom and dad had the kids in the first place. So they will inherit alleles for both. Do this often enough, and the genes for the traits and the genes for the preference begin behaving as if they are genetically linked. Now, I mentioned that genetic linkage, you should remember this from genetics. This is what you get when two different alleles are physically very close together on a chromosome, right? Yes, correct? And I mentioned briefly something called linkage disequilibrium, which is what you get when selection at one locus, selection acting on the allele frequencies of one gene, causes allele frequency change in another gene, right? When a gene may be becoming more common or more rare, not because that gene is particularly beneficial or harmful, but because it's somehow linked to another allele that is being selected, right? Remember this? The example I gave in class was, imagine that the gene for blue eyes was linked with the gene for foul body odor, right? We might expect blue eyes would become less common, not because there's anything wrong with blue eyes, but because the gene has the bad luck of being linked with a gene that makes you smell like fermented sardines. That's actually a delicacy in Sweden. They call it surströmming. Yeah, they ferment these sardines before they can them, and it's one of the most vile smelling foods on the planet. Naturally, some people really love it. Anyway, so we've already talked about linkage, and I talked about linkage disequilibrium, and something happens here. The gene for the trait and the gene for the preference won't necessarily be physically linked on a chromosome, but they will behave as if they are linked because they will always be inherited together. Every long-stroking male will have alleles for long stroking and alleles for preferring long stroking. And anything that causes an increase in the frequency of the alleles for the preference will cause an increase in the frequency of alleles for the trait. So if we have the long stroking and the preference for long stroking alleles inherited together, Then if the long strokers become more common, then if the let me do it this way. If those genes are acting linked and something, anything, could just be a random effect, makes the preference more common, then you'll have lots more females with a preference for long stroking. And that means they will seek out males that stroke long. And those males will have lots of offspring. And those offspring will inherit both the preference and the trait. So anything that makes one become more common is going to make the other become more common. And you have a case of runaway sexual selection. Basically a case where there's no real reason why it's happening other than any increase in the frequency of the preference makes the trait become more common, and any increase in the frequency of the trait makes the preference become more common. So anything that boosts one boosts the other, and anything that boosts the other boosts the first one, and so each one reinforces the other, and the frequency of both get higher and higher. So the preferred traits don't confer any particular benefits on either the male or the female. As far as the researchers into 11 spotted potato beetles were able to show, there was no particular benefit for long stroking or preferring long stroking. Long stroking does not confer direct benefits. It's not a marker of good genes. It doesn't make any sense, except long stroking is genetically correlated with the preference for long stroking. So if one becomes more common, the other becomes more common. Females that prefer males that have the desired trait will have offspring that themselves have the desired trait. This is sometimes called the sexy sons hypothesis. Right? If you are a female and you prefer long stroking, you will pick a long stroking male and you'll have male offspring that are long strokers. So if you're a female that likes the sexy trait, you will have male offspring that carry the sexy trait. All right, that's the sexy sons hypothesis. So there we have it. Yeah, the original paper is actually about 20 years old now. Female spotted cucumber beetles prefer males that stroke them. It does nothing, no benefit to the females, no benefit on the offspring. It's just that anything that makes one more, that makes the trait more common, makes the preference more common, and anything that makes the preference more common makes the trait more common. It's a runaway feedback loop. This has also been proposed for these stalk-eyed Malaysian flies. And yes, they have compound eyes. They're just on very long stalks. And there is a brain in that central head. It just has very long optic nerves. And this looks pretty darn outrageous. And it does seem to be sexual selection. Females prefer to mate with long-stalked males. And it seems to be runaway sexual selection. So this is an aspect of Ronald Fisher's sexy sons hypothesis. A female that picks a male that has a desirable trait will leave male offspring that are themselves desirable, who will leave many offspring of their own. And it doesn't matter what that trait is, it doesn't matter whether it's beneficial. You know, females that mate with long-stalked flies will produce long-stalked offspring that many females will want to mate with. Yeah, it's pretty weird looking, isn't it?
It's like they're living in like a third person perspective.
Yeah. It's weird. There are actually some deep sea fish where the larvae are born or hatched looking like that. I mean, not looking like a fly, but with these eyes on long flexible stalks. And what basically happens is the body gets bigger and the eventually catches up with its own eyes. So yeah, that's kind of weird. Okay, I've said my piece about sex, but we can actually step back and look at a wider area of behavior. If you've ever hung out with Dr. Hasselborn, you have heard, you're nodding, have you worked with her or?
Class.
Okay. Did you talk much about these guys?
Not that I remember.
Her research is on dictyostelid slime molds. They look like this under the microscope. They're very common in soils. If you know how to culture them, you can isolate them from just about any soil sample. And they spend most of their lives as a population of individual single-celled amoebas. Remember, an amoeba is a single-celled organism that has no fixed and definite shape, but just kind of flows around like a little blob. Sorry, one of my favorite classic cartoons is an amoeba wearing a cowboy hat and a cowboy vest and twirling a lariat, saying, "So, till next time, adios, amoebas." Okay, right. I thought it was funny. Anyway, these dictyostelid amoebas just crawl around as little inoffensive single-celled critters, feeding on bacteria in decayed leaves and soil, and just living as single-celled critters, and talking on their cellular phones. Get it? Right? Talking on their unicellular phones until food grows scarce. When they starve, they start following the advantage of the beetles on the leadoff track from Abbey Road, which, as you know, was called Come Together, right? Come together right now over me. Anyway, sorry. Those amoebas begin to crawl together into larger and larger clusters. Here you can see what it looks like when they've started to do it. And they form these millimeter scale slugs that may crawl around for some time. So it's kind of weird. Are they single-celled or are they multi-celled? Well, the answer is they're using a different type of multicellularity, in which the cells spend a large part of their lives separate, but can come together to make a multi-celled body. And the slug will crawl around and eventually it will stop and kind of clump up into a circle and then begin to grow a stalk. And at the end of the stalk, there is a sporangium, a place where spores are made. You can see several stages. At the left, you've got those things that look like little Hershey's Kisses are very early stage. And then in the middle, you can see some where the stalks are getting longer and longer. And at the far right, you have some that are where the sporangium is nearly mature. And the cells, the whole thing is made of those amoebas. The amoebas are collectively making these structures. And the amoebas that make it into that upper sphere turn into spores. They build a cell wall around themselves. When the sporangium dries out, the spores will drift away when the sporangium bursts open, and the spores will drift off to new habitats. And if all goes well, they'll hatch into a new generation of single-celled amoebas. Yes?
As in like endospores or like?
Just spores, not like bacteria, endospores. But yeah, it's fairly common for, there's a number of protists that can secrete thick walls, dry out, and rest for a while, and then come back to life when conditions are good. Sorry, I'm now envisioning a slime mold spore singing Evanescence. Bring me to life, wake me up inside, wake me up inside. Right. I'm not possibly bad at that. Here's where it gets weird. That's a drawing from a pivotal paper in the 1940s by a brilliant man named John Tyler Bonner, who first started asking questions about this. The stalk is made of amoebas. The attachment disc of the stalk is made of amoebas as well. The whole thing is just amoebas stacked one on top of the other, like the stack of Yertle the turtle, if you remember that Dr. Seuss book. Here's the thing, the amoebas in the stalk form cellulose cell walls and they die. The amoebas in the stalk do not survive. They're essentially committing suicide. The amoebas that make it into the sporangium do survive, but they survive at the expense of the amoebas that don't. That's weird. If you are an amoeba that ends up in the stalk, you leave no descendants at all. So you would think it would not be adaptive to be in the stalk. If you're an amoeba and you've got some kind of genes that will put you in the sporangium, those you would predict should be selected for. But then if no amoebas had genes for becoming part of the stalk, then the sporangium wouldn't form, or at least it wouldn't form high up, and the spores wouldn't disperse. So it looks as if some of these amoebas are sacrificing themselves so that the others can form spores in an elevated sporangium that can be caught by the wind and drift away. So how are they doing that? We call this altruism. It's the seeming giving up of a benefit for the sake of others. An organism increases other organisms' chance of reproducing at cost to itself. And we often measure the cost as decrease in fitness. And it's kind of hard to explain. How would selection favor individuals that don't pass on their genes? Well, you wouldn't think it would, but if that's the case, why do we still have stalk amoebas that sacrifice their lives so that the spore amoebas can drift away on the wind and hopefully make it to a better place? For slime molds, I don't think we fully understand this. We actually do know that this is under genetic control. You can develop stalkless mutants of the main species that's studied, Dictyostelium discoideum. So we can identify genes that are involved in producing a stalk. But as for exactly what they're doing there, last I talked with Dr. Hazelcorn, even she wasn't completely sure. This is an area of active research. People trying to figure out why this is. But it's a nifty introduction to a more general phenomenon that evolutionary biology has to explain, called altruism. Because we see this sort of thing that looks like self-sacrifice in other species as well. And I don't think we've got a good explanation yet as far as slime molds are concerned, but we have some explanations that seem to work for other species. The old explanation was something called group selection. The idea that individuals could evolve to sacrifice themselves for the good of the species. The problem is this doesn't seem possible under the standard model, because genes that have the effect of blocking themselves from getting passed on shouldn't become more common. And yet there are cases in which they have become more common. So what makes them do that? All right, you with me? Richard Dawkins is probably best known as an author and a popularizer of science. He has done original scientific work on his own, but most of his fame has come from publicizing and very clearly explaining ideas that were worked out by others in his field, notably a guy named George C. Williams and a man named William Hamilton and another chap named Robert Trivers. He wrote a book, it came out in 1976 and it's still in print, and it's called The Selfish Gene. And genes cannot really be selfish because genes are strips of DNA. Genes are just interesting collections of sugars, phosphates, and bases, right? Genes aren't intelligent and genes don't truly have interests because genes can't think, because genes are big molecules. That's all they are. But Dawkins introduced the metaphor of the selfish gene as a way of thinking about how things like altruism could evolve. And he pointed out that genes and the organisms that carry genes don't always have the same interests. Or to put it another way, without using that loaded term interests, factors that make a gene become more common are not always the same thing as the factors that make an organism become more common. There are things that will cause one to become more common at the expense of the other. The old explanation, again, was that selection could favor altruism for the good of the group, but Williams and Hamilton and company had argued that this isn't possible. Let me explain why. Imagine we've got a town where, in the words of the old country song, everybody knows everybody and everybody calls you friend. You don't need an invitation. Take off your shoes and come on in. Anybody know that one? That's where I'm from, and I'm proud to say I'm from the country and I like it that way. Okay, nobody is trying to sing along, but okay. Imagine you're in a town where everybody knows everybody and everybody is self-sacrificing to everybody. If you need some money, people will fall all over themselves trying to give it to you. Everybody takes care of everybody else and everybody helps everyone out, even at great expense to themselves. Okay, right? So we have this kind of paradise right here. The first confidence trickster that walks in is going to take everybody's money and clean the damn town out and probably ruin it, right? Yes? The same logic applies to species. Imagine we've got a species whose genes influence every member of the species in being altruistic to every other. The very first mutant whose genes influence it to accept benefits but never give is going to clean out that population completely. That mutant is going to prosper. Everybody else is screwed. And that mutant is going to pass on lots of copies of its genes because it will be very successful. And basically the entire population should see a very rapid increase in the frequency of genes that influence that kind of selfish behavior. So a species in which everybody sacrifices themselves for the common good should rapidly get taken over by mutants that don't sacrifice themselves for the common good. Right? Am I making a certain degree of sense there? Dawkins explains it like this. Genes are the fundamental units of selection. When we measure the effects of selection, what we're measuring is allele frequencies, right? Selection is defined as increase or decrease in frequencies of alleles. That's gene-centered evolution. Not everybody agrees with him, by the way. This is not necessarily the best, but bear with me for right now. Genes that are favored by selection are genes whose effects on phenotype maximize those genes' probability of replication. All right, a gene that does something to the phenotype that increases the odds of that gene being passed on, that gene is going to get passed on. those effects don't always look favorable to the organism that's carrying the genes. Give a simple example. Let's say that because of a mutation, a gene appears among humanity that triples your fertility, triples your sex drive, triples your desire to have kids, makes you have 3 times as many offspring as anybody else, and makes your head explode when you're 40. Okay? Having your head explode at 40 might really suck. Yes? But we would predict that gene is going to become more common because the gene's effect on phenotype is to increase the number of copies of that gene. Right? If that gene cranks up your fertility to 11 and makes you have lots and lots of kids, then by definition, that gene is going to become more common, even if it has the effect of making your head explode. Okay? Am I making sense there? So the effect that that gene has on the phenotype would be increasing the gene's probability of getting passed on, even if it's decreasing the lifespan or the quality of life of the organisms that have it. And that's what I mean when I say that the interests of a gene and an organism that carries a gene are not necessarily the same thing. So genes will look as if they're acting to maximize their own replication, regardless of whether or not they are particularly beneficial to the individuals that have them. And that's why Richard Dawkins called them selfish genes. They're not really being selfish. They can't be, because a gene is a strip of deoxyribonucleic acid. It's not conscious. It can't really be selfish. It can't try anything. So the whole thing is a metaphor, and you can't take it too seriously. But it's a metaphor that seems to work in explaining a number of phenomena, including altruism. So what happens? How do you get altruistic behavior evolving? You know, the common idea of what natural selection involves, that whole survival of the fittest thing that makes me so mad, is that organisms ought to be, in theory, out only for their own interests and competing with everybody else. So how would you ever get altruism? There's several things that can cause the evolution of altruism. And in some cases, altruistic behaviors may be favored because it's the only way that anybody is going to survive. You get this when populations have a dominance hierarchy, like the pecking order that chickens develop. And you can get it when the environment is harsh. And here's a species that's got both. That's the Galapagos hawk again. I mentioned this way back when I was talking about Darwin in the Galapagos and pointing out that this is a hawk in the genus Buteo. Incidentally, if you're British, you would call this hawk a buzzard. British colonists in North America used the word for a different species because the early colonists were more interested with surviving and not getting killed than with identifying birds properly. So that's why in American English, when we say buzzard, we mean a New World vulture. In Britain, if you say buzzard, you mean a small hawk in the genus Buteo. So anyway, whatever you call it, this is one of those species that's unique to the Galapagos, but it's got close relatives in North and South America. This is in the same genus as the red-tailed hawk and the red-shouldered hawk that you see around here on any given day. The Galapagos hawk is, again, the Galapagos are harsh. Remember, they are islands on the equator, but they are not islands with lavish coconut palms and people serving you fruity rum drinks with paper umbrellas. Okay, this is not, I don't know, help me out. What's what's the best beach for drinking rum drinks and paper umbrellas in Brazil that you've ever been to?
Probably South,
Which one?
South Brazil.
Okay, in South Brazil?
Yeah.
Okay, this is not South Brazil. This is a rough place. Remember, drought is very common. And these are predators. And because prey is not very common, they have to have large hunting territories. In this species, what you get is groups of unrelated males will all take turns mating with a single female, and they'll share parental care. This seems odd because if you recall, remember that the sex that has more to lose by Bateman's rule should be, in theory, the picky one, and the one that has less investment should be seeking out more opportunities to reproduce, right? If all you're contributing is sperm, then in theory, you should be seeking out as many opportunities to spread that as possible. Under Bateman's rule, males, it should be adapted for males to be promiscuous and females not. This is clearly a case where that doesn't work. But when you're living like this, each male hawk has fewer chances to pass his genes on than he would if he could have a female all to himself, which is what other hawks do. You know, a male that could do all of the mating with one female should leave more offspring than a male that has to share a female with several others. Right? Am I making sense there? So why do we have this? This is altruism, because a male that has to share a female is seemingly giving up a fitness benefit. The fitness, again, is just number of offspring. You know, a male that has to share a female is going to leave fewer offspring than a male that has a female all to himself. But the Galapagos environment is really harsh, and Buteo must defend large territories to survive. These birds are territorial, and because there's not a lot of prey, they have to defend large territories. And it turns out that if you have just a lone pair of one male and one female, they're going to get driven out of the best hunting territories, because a group of males is more effective in defending a large and high quality territory, much more effective than a single male and female could ever be. So in this case, you have males that share a female, basically because that's the only option for securing a high quality hunting territory in the middle of a bunch of desert islands. Am I making sense there? Yes.
So you could call the cooperative males wingmen then.
Well, okay, wing, wing. Thank you.
Sorry, you don't get.
Very good, very good. Well, in this case, I guess every male would get a chance to be a wingman and a chance to actually have the date. Yeah, they do take turns, and that might seem like it's not advantageous for the males that participate in it, but you don't really have any other options. This behavior is favored because there's no other way to defend a high quality hunting territory and get food for everybody. Right? You do it this way because there really is no other workable option. Dawkins named something called the green beard effect, and I mentioned this earlier. He thought this was purely a theoretical possibility, but we've actually found a very nifty real-world example of the green beard effect. And he says, imagine a gene that does two things. It gives people that have the gene have green beards. Okay, very distinctive trait. But the gene has two effects, and the other effect is it makes people with green beards want to help other people with green beards. Okay, with me there. Okay, it's distinctive And it makes people that have that gene want to help other people that have that gene. So if you have this gene, you're born with a green beard, and you're born with an innate desire to help everybody else that's got a green beard. So imagine a gene that confers a recognizable trait and causes individuals that have that trait to behave altruistically. When that happens, a green beard gene is going to become more common because you have a gene that both confers a trait and causes individuals that have it to cooperate with each other. And this is a really cool real world example. The test tubes up there show brewer's yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, used as a lab organism, but also used for centuries to make beer. Even before the microscope had been invented, brewers knew that you had to have something in your beer that would make it ferment and then fall to the bottom if you wanted to make beer. They didn't know what the substance was, but they actually had a name for it. They called it God is good. So there are some varieties of yeast that if you grow them in liquid, they will clump together in these little cottage cheese-like clumps that are called flocks, F-L-O-C, no K on the end. The strains that are used in brewing are like this. If you add brewing yeast to malt, to a sweet liquid made from grain, the yeast will start breaking down the sugar. Once they've used up the oxygen, they'll start breaking down the sugar into carbon dioxide and alcohol, which is what you want. And they will eventually form these flocks, and they'll fall to the bottom, leaving behind, after about 2 weeks in a typical 5-gallon batch, they'll leave behind a clear beer, which you then siphon off and bottle. I used to do home brewing quite a lot, not so much now. So the strains that are used in the commercial production of beer flocculate. They produce these flocks that fall to the bottom. The strains that are most commonly used in laboratory research don't flocculate, which is why scientists didn't realize that this was going on sooner. So we have both flocculent and non-flocculent strains. You can see the difference in liquid culture up at the top. At the bottom, you can see what they look like. Under the electron microscope, the flocculent genes tend to pack, the flocculent yeast, tend to pack together more tightly. And they flocculate because they've got a single gene called FLO1, and that codes for a cell surface protein that binds to cell walls. And so a flocculent yeast that produces that FLO1 protein tends to bind to other yeast that also have the FLO1 protein. You with me there? Why is it adaptive to flocculate? Well, it turns out that flocculent yeast are much better at surviving chemical shocks. If you have a bunch of yeast and you zap them with an antibiotic called amphotericin B, virtually all of the non-flocculent yeast get killed. The flocculent yeast, on the other hand, the ones on the outside of a flock will get killed, but the ones on the inside are protected. Right? It's kind of like a riot breaking out in a prison, and when the guards start shooting, the prisoners go into a tight huddle. The prisoners on the outside might get shot, but they're protecting the prisoners on the inside. Same thing here. When you have yeast in a flock, the ones on the outside might die. The ones on the inside survive because these flocculent yeast shield each other. The same is true when you hit them with peroxide that kills virtually all of your non-flocculent yeast. But roughly 80% of the flocculent yeast survive. Alcohol, it's the same thing. The flocculent yeast have a better survival rate when hit with alcohol. There's no difference for just freezing and thawing or for high temperatures. But when you hit these yeast with a chemical insult, the flocculent yeast are much more likely to survive. And flocculent yeast tend to stick together almost exclusively. Yes?
But it looks like on the last one, high temperatures, the flocculent ones have less of a chance.
Okay, yeah, I'm not entirely sure why that would be, but it's not like either one has a good chance. You know, 20% of the non-flocculent survive and 10% of the flocculent. And that's some pictures of flocks that have been sliced in two and hit with a chemical stain in which dead yeast stain blue and live yeast don't stain. It's a chemical stain that living cells will pump out and dead cells no longer can pump out. So that's why dead are stained blue, living are not stained. So there's a control flock where virtually all of the yeast are alive. When they've been hit with an antifungal drug, you see a blue rim around the outside. That's the yeast that are directly exposed to the fungal drug. But the yeast that are inside the flock survive. The same is true, number 3, that's 70% ethanol for 5 minutes. 4 is 70% ethanol for 45 minutes. And you can see there is a lot more death. But the cells on the inside of the flock survive. Am I making sense there? So that's a green beard gene because it gives you a trait. In this case, it's a surface protein. And it makes you altruistic towards other individuals that have that trait. Yeast cells with the flock protein bind with yeast cells that don't have the flock protein. Isn't that cool? Yeah, so that's a real example of the green beard effect. Most altruism probably has different mechanisms, and a common one is reciprocity. If an organism that helps another gives up a benefit to give that benefit to another organism, if an organism that helps another has a good chance of getting helped later on, the benefits of altruism may outweigh the risks, and altruistic behavior becomes favored by selection. This doesn't happen in every species, but you see it in, first of all, species in which individuals associate together for a long time. Species that live in herds or flocks, where individuals are going to be living together in a larger unit. And it happens in organisms where individuals are intelligent enough that they can recognize each other. And they can recognize and avoid potential cheaters. Species where this sort of thing evolves also have to have the possibility of role reversal, where any individual on any given day could be either a donor or a recipient. And finally, the benefit for the recipient has to outweigh the cost to the donor. This actually, again, you've got to be careful talking about human behavior, but let's use a human example that might make things a little clearer. You've got a circle of friends, I assume, right? You've got people that you know, people that you like and get along with. And let's say one of them comes up to you and says, dude, I'm starving. Can you lend me 20 bucks? Okay, presumably because you were not a jerk, you give it to them if you've got 20 bucks. That seems like a reasonable sum. If they're asking for $2,000, it may be a different story. But spotting a friend at 20 isn't that big a deal. Now, why would you do that? Well, maybe it's because you like them, but I mean, how does that fit the situation here? Well, first of all, your circle of friends tends to maintain itself for a long period of time. And you probably know the person you've given money reasonably well. You're not giving it to somebody who just met 5 minutes ago, right? So we have long associations. Humans are very, very good at recognizing each other. And we're very good at keeping track of cheaters. In, of course, finance, this is done by things like credit ratings. But even more informally, humans have a pretty good way of assessing, who is likely to pay me back and am I likely never to see again. We keep pretty good tabs on the trustworthiness of the people that we know. I won't ask anyone to do it, but you could probably list several people that you would do anything for, and several people where you might like them, but if you shake hands with them, you're going to count your fingers afterwards. You can probably list people that you would gladly give all the money you had for if they needed it, and probably a larger number of people that if you give them $10, you just know you're never going to see it again. People are very good at keeping track of who has screwed them in the past and who's been there for them. Okay, role reversal. The person that just asked you for $20 for lunch because they're starving, next week that could be you, right? On any given day, it could be a different one of your friends that needs help from everybody else, right? So role reversal happens. And then benefit to the recipient outweighs cost to the donor. In absolute terms, that's not true, because $20 is $20 regardless of who has it. But if you're doing really well, $20 is not that big a deal. If you're starving, $20 may be the difference between making it through the day and not making it through the day, right? A good meal is worth more to somebody who's been going hungry than to somebody who already can have any good meal that he wants to. Yes? So in that case, even though $20 has a fixed economic value relative to the situation that you're in, the benefit to the recipient outweighs the cost of the donor, right? The recipient is getting a chance to make it through the day. The donor is not losing a large fraction of the donor's wealth. Am I making sense? Okay. So to see how this plays out, let's look at vampire bats. Vampire bats roost in small colonies in caves and places like that in Central America. I'm not sure how far south they get into South America. Do you have these guys in Brazil?
Vampire bat?
Yeah. Because you get them in South Mexico, Guatemala, but I'm not sure how far south they might get into South America.
I am not sure, to be honest, but I know I was scared of them.
Okay, all right. Yeah, they will bite humans and lap up their blood. They've got very sharp teeth and anesthetic saliva. So they'll basically make a wound on a large animal, which could be a human if you're sleeping outdoors without a net, or it could be a cow or something like that. They'll lap up the blood. And here's the thing, flying is very energetically expensive, which means that vampire bats are frequently on the edge of starvation. They have to spend a huge amount of, blood is pretty nutrient rich, but they have to expend a lot of calories just to fly. And a vampire bat that fails to find a blood meal within 60 hours of its last meal is in imminent danger of dying from starvation. They can't skip too many meals. And vampire bats have been observed feeding each other by means of regurgitation. A bat that's, yeah, I said it. Yeah, a bat that hasn't fed will pair up with a bat that has fed, and the bat that has fed will barf up some of the blood that it just fed on and keep its starving neighbor alive. Isn't that just lovely? Doesn't that just warm your heart at how giving vampire bats are?
Sweet in a macabre.
What's that?
It's sweet in a macabre way.
Vampire bats will give up their blood to feed the starving, like, we are the bats, we are the vampires. And you guys don't remember that because that was 1985. Anybody heard the song? a whole bunch of like the top pop singers in the world at the time came together and did this benefit song to raise money for the famine that was hitting Africa at the time. They called themselves USA for Africa, and they raised millions of dollars because the single became a hit and like everybody bought it. And some of that money may actually have reached Africa. I think they were a little fuzzy on that part.
I
Yes.
like that one stupid single called a whole bunch of celebrities and they sung. What's the name of that song? I don't know. Sorry, I don't remember.
Oh, yeah. Well, I remember seeing a bunch of Canadian artists did a song. It was all done on Zoom, like right about at the time the lockdown was hitting. That was 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And that actually got to be sort of popular. There was a heavy metal song like that where, you know, all of the great guitar shredders of 1986 recorded this song called Stars. It was actually really good. And there was a Mexican version where they got a bunch of the best Latino pop singers to do this song called Cantaré, Cantarás. I will sing, you will sing. And Saturday Night Live had a bit with a whole bunch of pop stars doing this benefit song for free range chicken.
It was a match that the celebrities got together.
Okay, yeah.
Were you talking about like We Are the Change or something with Michael Jackson?
We Are the World? Yeah.
Yeah, We Are.
Yeah, Michael Jackson wrote the song and he was in it.
I seen like memes of him like singing and some guy, I forget his name, but pop singer would start singing. You could tell like he was like, no, like that's not what I want to do with the song.
Okay, we'll watch this at the break. It's a somewhat uplifting. It's about as uplifting as it gets, considering that we're in a ruthless capitalist economy. Anyway, bats help each other out and feed each other. They're going, we are the bats, right? 70% of the time that happens between mothers and their babies, and that's considered parental care. I'll talk a little bit more about that after the break. But the rest of the feeding can happen between bats that are related or sometimes bats that are completely unrelated. You can have bats that are perfect strangers feeding each other blood when it's needed. Now, here's the thing. First of all, it usually happens between bats that are close neighbors. When bats roost, they tend to roost in the same spot. So when you hang upside down from the roof of a cave, your neighbors are bats that you have hung upside down next to probably for most of your life. And bats are intelligent enough that they can recognize individuals and recognize who their neighbors are. And let's see, the benefit to the donor outweighs the cost to the recipient. Again, because half a blood meal will increase the risk of starvation of the donor, but it saves the life of a recipient. The donor has maybe a little bit less margin to find a blood meal, but the recipient's dead if he doesn't get it. So the benefit to the donor, to the recipient outweighs the cost of the donor. That's what I meant. And it's reciprocal. Any bat could need a blood meal or could have some spare blood on any given night, depending on how the night's feeding has gone. So that matches all the criteria for reciprocal altruism. It's been modeled that if you had a colony where nobody shared any blood, you would expect that each year 82% of its adult members would die. The actual adult mortality is only 24%. Basically, everybody's chances of survival go up in a population where you have this reciprocal altruism. It's ultimately beneficial for everybody. Or as Michael Jackson said, there's a choice we're making. We're saving our own lives. It's true, we make a better day because we're vampire bats. I'm going to play this at the break. I am deeply scarred and cynical now because I'm a Generation Xer and it's 2020 goddamn 2. But it was nice for a while to be able to believe in the power of pop music to change the world in a good way. I mean, yeah, I mean, it all just really sucks, but it was a nice illusion to have for a while. So bats are smart enough that they can recognize other individual bats. And you'll get a case where unrelated bats might form buddy systems. Two bats will take turns feeding only each other. This tends to avoid problems with cheaters. Bats can recognize other bats that they've shared with before, and bats that have screwed them over don't get a chance. Okay, just like you would probably lend $20 to your close friends that you like and that you see every day, but you're not going to lend $20 to some random, right? Yes, bats do the same thing. That's reciprocal altruism. And I tell you what, that's actually a pretty good place to take a break. It's 11:35. Tell you what, take 10 and we'll come back at 11:45 and I'll stop the recording.